right. So yes, thank you for having me today. I enjoyed Charlotte's presentation so much, and I think our two papers combine very nicely in their ideas. I will say, just as a preface to my talk, um, I may be a unique participant this weekend in that my main area of research is not Agatha Christie or crime fiction, nor are the observations that I'm about to make part of a larger project. So I apologize if there are any limitations felt in the scope of this analysis. I've just been fascinated by Endless Night as a text since I read it a few years ago, and so I appreciate the opportunity to explore some ideas about it. All right. Endless Night is one of the darkest and most unusual of Agatha Christie's novels. By the time of the novel's publication in 1967, this darkness in her characters and plots was not unique. There's nothing cozy about Christie at the end of the day. Nor was the concept of a narrator murderer new, for she had already presented this trick in The Murder of Roger Ackroyd 40 years earlier, which I'm sure we're all familiar with, um, in 1926. Moreover, The Case of the Caretaker, a short story from 1942, is merely a shorter version of Endless Night's more fleshed out characters and plot. Despite these connections to earlier works, however, this novel stands out as more of a psychological thriller than detective story. Ellie, the first discovered murder victim, is not killed until the 17th chapter of the 24-chapter novel. The buildup to the murder makes it clear that this is not a text concerned primarily with puzzles and detection. Christie takes time and makes masterful use of first-person storytelling to create more complex characters, placing the emphasis on what leads to murder versus the process of unmasking the murderer. This allows for a number of different issues to emerge, including issues of gender and the power struggles that develop between genders when considering motivation for murder. There's a lot more to say about the topic of gender and power dynamics across the Christie canon, and more to say about this novel than what I can cover in the next few minutes. But for now, I want to briefly explore the complex power structure that is formulated through this novel's plot and characters, and how that speaks to ideas of gender roles. I ultimately want to question where the power in this novel lies and how that power may be tied to gender. For those who may not have read Endless Night recently or at all, I just want to give a quick overview so that we're all on the same page with what happens in this Christie novel. Michael Rogers, or Mike, is the first person narrator who recounts how he decides to live at a place called Gypsy's Acre and how he meets his wife, Ellie, a young, wealthy heiress. After Ellie turns 21 and has independent access to her wealth, she buys the old house. She and Mike elope, and they have a new house built, despite warnings from a local gypsy woman that the land is cursed and they are in danger. Eventually, her cautionary words appear to be apt, as Ellie is killed while riding one day. In an astounding plot twist, Mike reveals to the reader that he, alongside Ellie's companion Greta, murdered Ellie for her fortune by poisoning her with cyanide hidden in her allergy capsules. This is not the first time that he is murdered. Note, though, that his two previous victims, not killed within the time frame of this novel, were both male. Nor is Ellie the only victim in the novel. Mrs. Lee, the gypsy woman, is killed after Mike bribes her to scare Ellie, and Claudia Hardcastle is killed accidentally after taking another poisoned allergy capsule. However, after celebrating their victory, Mike is haunted by thoughts of Ellie and in a fit of rage, strangles Greta. After he is imprisoned, he insists on writing his story down, and thus the novel circles back to where it began. Understanding the motivations behind each of these deaths, particularly those of the women, is perhaps the first place to start in unpacking how power in different forms becomes connected to gender. In Peril at End House, Poirot lists to Hastings the different motives for murder: gain, hate, or love turned to hate, jealousy, and fear. He also includes the possibility of homicidal mania and, quote, killing done on the spur of the moment under the impulse of ungovernable temper as motives for murder, but he dismisses these quickly as they do not apply in the particular case in Peril at End House. Interestingly, though, Endless Night does not portray just one of these motives, but arguably encapsulates them all. Furthermore, each of the motives of murder can be linked to the type of power that the female characters have and how that power impacts their male murderer, Michael Rogers. First, Ellie is killed for gain and out of jealousy. Her power lies in her social status as a young American heiress of a vast fortune. Because of this, she eclipses Mike in the traditionally masculine role of providing financially for their home and future. Mike, envious of this wealth, which represents greater social and marital status, kills her, and in doing so, reestablishes patriarchal order. Thus, what motivates her murder directly aligns with her source of power. She is victimized by a man who feels victimized by society for not simply awarding him, at the age of 22, economic advancement. Mike's male entitlement and greed leads to him circumventing her power through taking her life. Second, Mrs. Lee, a gypsy woman who lives near the Rogers home at Gypsy's Acre, is killed out of fear, which is the power she expresses in this story. She makes people, especially Ellie, afraid. However, we find out during Mike's confession that he paid Mrs. Lee to frighten Ellie, which means that she is manipulated by a man as an object of fear while seeking her own financial gain. Ultimately, though, it is Mike who becomes afraid of Mrs. Lee and the power she has over him. The potential she could expose him and his bribery leads to her death. Third, Greta is killed as love shifts quite suddenly to hate. This shift is an astonishing twist and speaks to the power that she possessed over Mike as an object of sexual desire. He says of Greta, she was glorious. She was the most glorious and the most lovely thing I'd ever seen. She was like a Brunhild, a super Valkyrie with shining golden hair. She smelt and looked and tasted of sex. Her physicality and sexuality draw Mike to her, but beyond her appearance, her logical mind and lack of sentimentality and morality are key to her power. Indeed, she is the architect of the murder, just as Santonix is architect of the new Rogers home. She is calculated and rational, never portrayed as highly emotional. In contrast to her, Mike appears to be the one who is insecure, or at least unsure. When she tells him that he is attractive to women and can easily seduce Ellie, he asks, "Do you think she'd look at someone like me?" And his thoughts trail on to wonder, why should a rich girl who could have her pick of any attractive, sexy man she liked go for me? Suggesting that his insecurity in this moment is based on looks and anxiety more stereotypically associated with the opposite gender. Their gender dynamics are complicated further by their plans for Ellie's fortune. Greta wants to see the world, her financial gain providing greater freedom from the societal norm of house and husband. Mike, though, is obsessed with Gypsy's Acre, as he is throughout the book. He desires that secure domestic sphere, and he begins to see that he had that traditional home with Ellie before he murdered her. As he feels this shift in gender roles, Greta taking on the masculine, non-hysterical, unsentimental space, stereotypical space that is, while he only grows more hysterical, and as he begins to understand that what Greta's power over him has cost, he lashes out with verbal abuse and expresses physical dominance in strangling her. Thus, she too suffers for the power she has. Overall, there is a sense that these women were punished with death for daring to express female power that might somehow contradict that of the opposite gender. While these murders are committed within the categorization of motives Poirot establishes in Peril at End House, their female gender appears to play a part in why their power becomes threatening enough to provoke murder. Another source of power common to all of these women is knowledge. What each of these women knows while they are alive seems to be a force that Mike fixates on because he does not understand it. He is unsure of how much they know specifically about him and what they might be capable of given that knowledge. This establishes an anxiety about the female mind, and this power can be further displayed, about the female mind, and this power can be further tied back to their gender, playing on the stereotype of women as keen observers and conveyors of information or gossips. Mike acknowledges, but also worries about the knowledge each woman possesses, including one non-murder victim, his own mother. He says, "I was always nervous with Mom. I always felt she knew too much about me." He expresses a concern about his mother looking at him, watching him, a discomfort with the power of the eye to see more than one would want. With Greta, however, he is comforted by her knowledge. He claims Greta had known me for what I was the first moment we met. This comfort of being understood has its limits, though, as again, in the end, he turns against her for what her knowledge has brought about. She was the one who had knowledge of Ellie and knowledge of how to get away with her murder. Thus, the plot is built around what she knows and how she applies that information against another woman to achieve her own ends and assist her male lover. Her power and its influence are only compromised after Mike begins to question what they have done. Admittedly, however, she did need him in order for this scheme to work. And so this sharing of power via a partnership has a necessary compromise, though one that does not achieve its goal in the end of reaping the benefits, the financial benefits from murder. When it comes to what Ellie knows or does not know, Mike admits that he was never quite sure. He says, "Sometimes I was nervous that Ellie might guess or something, but I don't think she did. I don't know. I don't know really. I never did know about Ellie." The audience can only speculate as well on what Ellie may have known and chosen to accept or was blind to in the end. While the knowledge these women did possess may or may, um, excuse me, while the knowledge these women did possess or may not have possessed does not necessarily result in a motive for murder, and here Greta and Mrs. Lee are exceptions. It does seem to suggest that because they knew too much, they were deemed problematic to the status quo in some way. It is ironic that Mike has a fear of being known by these women, and yet the entire narrative is based on the idea that he wants people to know his story. Yes. Um, this is made clear by how he describes the story's beginnings. One of the doctors kept asking me if there was anything I wanted. I said there was. I said there was only one thing I wanted. I said I wanted a ball pen and a lot of paper. I wanted, you see, to write down all about it, how it all came to happen. I wanted to tell them what I'd felt, what I'd thought. The more I thought about myself, the more interesting I thought it would be to everybody, because I was interesting. I was a really interesting person, and I'd done interesting things. The repetition that strings these sentences together establishes the self-centered nature of Mike's desire and perspective on the story. York argues in Agatha Christie, Power and Illusion, that love of power entails a will to make one's world fit one's desires, to see others as instruments rather than obstacles, to know one's rightness. And so it is in the Christian scheme of things, profoundly ambiguous, an assertion of the self against a pervading dullness, a demonstration of strength, and a destructive force suppressing the freedom of one's familiars, a demonstration of selfishness. Mike's desperation for pen and paper reflects this desire for power over the construction of the pieces formed to create his own story. The women are not merely objects in his narrative, but archetypes to be fit within a long established structure, a long established story structure, that is. Each of them fits into a specific female archetypal role. Ellie, the maiden, Mrs. Rogers, the mother, Mrs. Lee, the mystic, and Greta, the lover. Meanwhile, Mike takes on the role of tragic male hero questing for glory, thwarted by his own hubris. This connection to such archetypes suggests an insistence on traditional structures of gender roles and attempts to withhold the power over the story from the female characters. However, the idea of the heroic is directly contrasted by a sense of weakness that further complicates assertions of power on the part of the narrator. There is an anxiety about weakness that pervades both Endless Night and its forebearer, The Murder of Roger Ackroyd. In both, the murder is provoked by the male murderer feeling a sense of weakness, though these aspects manifest differently in each. In The Murder of Roger Ackroyd, Caroline, Dr. Shepard's sister, has this conversation with Poirot in the presence of her brother. Poirot questions, but weakness, where does it end? Exactly, said Caroline, take James here, weak as water if I weren't about to look after him. And she goes on to insist, you are weak, James. With a bad upbringing, heaven knows what mischief he might have gotten into by now. Shepard dismisses these assertions and does not object outwardly to them, but they become the key to Poirot seeing through Shepard's facade of humble doctor to reveal him as the murderer. While the specificity of this weakness is ambiguous, the reader can at least grasp that there is some suggestion of him being a weak individual that could be compromised in some way, and that is directly tied to his act of murder as a demonstration of power and control. Mike could be said to have the same kind of weakness as Shepard, for he does prove himself to be quite mentally and morally compromised, but a more superficial weakness dominates his early actions. Mike does not have social or economic status, a lack that makes him anxious about what all the other men who appear in the story think of him. Thus, his actions of murdering Ellie to gain her fortune demonstrate a longing for possession and control that is linked to constructions of masculinity and patriarchy. Both Shepard and Mike Rogers, conveniently for the reader, feel empowered to explain themselves and have the last word. Indeed, the way that the beginning and the ending lines of Endless Night connect to one another means that his narrative can have continuous cyclical power. Thus, as narrator-murderer, they find a power that attempts to eclipse their weaknesses as men and address their morally subversive behaviors. It would be easy to say that the power, therefore, lies with the narrator, and that Mike thus demonstrates a male dominance over the women of the story. But Christie never calls us to settle for the easy solution. What we actually see in this narrative structure is a representation of women as seen through the male gaze of the narrator. The women are constructed through his mind's eye, and because he is proven to be unreliable, we need not accept what he perceives. I think this leads the reader to a more significant question about what larger societal narratives gender is read through. She calls upon us to question our narrators and reread what we have been told before. Megan Hoffman argues in her book on gender and representation in crime fiction that bodies, particularly women's bodies, both dead and alive, represent sites of social and sexual deviance that must be resolved, buried, at the narrative's end so that order can be restored, however superficially. Christie chooses to subvert this call to order, though, by having the ghostly figure of Ellie appear to Mike as he makes his triumphal return to Gypsy's Acre, having supposedly gotten away with murder. Mike explains that I knew she was dead, but I saw her. She was dead, and her body was buried in the cemetery in the USA. But all the same, she was standing under the fir tree and she was looking at me. This inability to maintain power over Ellie and her impact on his mind reflects the lingering power struggle present at the end of the novel. In this case, it seems that the victim, not the victimizer, is given the ultimate power. Mike acknowledges in the end that nothing mattered anymore except Ellie. Here, Christie allows justice for these women to be achieved, and in doing so, makes it clear that victims, both male and female, matter. Thank you.